Hello and welcome. My name is Rooshan Saeed and I'm a paralegal in the Housing and Property Disputes Department. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Nikki Basin.
Hello, my name is Nikki Basin. I'm a solicitor here at Anthony Gold in the Housing and Property Disputes Department.
In this video, we'll be discussing the Supreme Court's recent decision in Rakusen and Jepsen and others. We'll be looking at what is a rent repayment order, the background of the case, the Supreme Court's decision, and the subsequent impact of the decision on both landlords and tenants in the private rented sector in England. Before we start discussing the details of the case, it might be beneficial to understand what a rent repayment order is.
Of course, yes. A rent repayment order is an order made by the tribunal for the repayment of an amount of rent or to repay the local authority housing benefit or universal credit which has been paid in respect of rent. A rent repayment order application can be made by a tenant or the local authority if the landlord has committed one of the offences set out in Section 40, subsection 3 of the Housing and Planning Act. This includes offences like unlawful eviction or failure to license, amongst many others.
So now moving into the details of the case, who were the parties involved?
Mr. Rakusen owned a flat in London. In this case, he was the superior landlord of the tenants rather than their direct or immediate landlord. For a tenant, a superior landlord is not the same as the immediate landlord. It is your landlord's landlord or someone even higher up that chain if there are several leases. Mr. Jepsen and others were the tenants in this case.
So what was the factual background of the case?
Mr. Rakusen granted a tenancy of his flat to Kensington Property Investment Group Limited for a term of around 36 months. The agreement was a standard form short-term residential tenancy in which Mr. Rakusen was responsible for the upkeep of the property. However, the tenancy did allow Kensington Property Investment Group to sublet the whole or parts of his flat. Kensington Property Investment Group Limited entered into separate agreements with the tenants, each of whom was granted the right to occupy one room in Mr. Rakusen's flat. As a result, the flat was a house in multiple occupation and required to be licensed under Part 2 of the Housing Act 2004. It is unclear if Kensington Property Investment Group Limited did apply for a license. However, during the relevant time, no license had been granted.
So I understand that a rent repayment order application is usually brought in the first-tier tribunal. So how did this case end up in the Supreme Court?
That's correct. A rent repayment order application does start in the first-tier tribunal. This claim started in the first-tier tribunal as a rent repayment order application against Mr. Rakusen and his wife, who jointly owned the flat with him. The application was made for the sum of £26,140. The application was made on the basis that Mr. Rakusen and his wife, who jointly owned the flat with him, were a person in control or management of an unlicensed house in multiple occupation. Mr. Rakusen and his wife invited the tribunal to strike out the application against them on the basis that they were not a person in control or management of an unlicensed house in multiple occupation. The first-tier tribunal only struck out the case against Mr. Rakusen's wife, but refused to strike out the case against him.
And why did they refuse to do that?
The first-tier tribunal was bound by an earlier upper tribunal decision where it had been decided that a rent repayment order can be made against the superior landlord as well as an immediate landlord. Go back to your question on how this ended up in the Supreme Court. So after the case was in the first-tier tribunal, Mr. Rakusen then appealed in the upper tribunal, and his appeal was dismissed. The upper tribunal's interpretation of the wording in the Housing and Planning Act 2016 was that a rent repayment order could be made against the superior landlord. The case then went up to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal held that the wording meant that a rent repayment order can be made against the immediate landlord only, and then it was further appealed in the Supreme Court.
So what was the question in front of the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court was asked to consider the question of can a rent repayment order only be made against an immediate landlord, or can a superior landlord also be liable?
And what did the Supreme Court decide?
The Supreme Court decided that a rent repayment order cannot be made against a superior landlord and dismissed the appeal. The Supreme Court held that a rent repayment order can only be made against the immediate landlord. The court described that its own interpretation of landlord as straightforward interpretation, and that in this case the simple answer was the correct answer. The court's decision did run through various arguments made by the parties about the effectiveness of rent repayment orders and Parliament's intention. The court didn't attach great significance to those arguments because it considered that the meaning of the legislation was clear.
Now that we've had this decision, what is the likely impact on landlords?
So, for a landlord, this means that a rent repayment order can only be made against the immediate landlord, and superior landlords can no longer be held liable for rent repayment orders against them.
And conversely, what is the impact of the decision on tenants?
For tenants who are looking to bring a rent repayment order application, they can only apply against the immediate landlord. In certain circumstances, that would mean that tenants would be left in vulnerable situations where their immediate landlord is a company who doesn't have any assets to enforce the rent repayment order against.
We hope that you found this video helpful. We have a team of solicitors who specialize in housing and property disputes, including rent repayment order applications. If you'd like advice or assistance, then please get in touch by clicking the link in the description.